The reason the experience of falling in love is not an adequate foundation for marriage is it's temporary. We've studied it. It has a 2-year lifespan. That's the average. Some a little more, some a little less, but average 2 years, you're in this euphoric state where you just feel like this is the most wonderful person in the world. There's nothing wrong with them. They're absolutely perfect. You know, your mother can see their flaws. She will say, honey, have you considered they haven't had a steady job in 5 years? Right. But you can't see their flaws. During that stage, they're just perfect. And we think, at least I thought when I got married, this is the real thing. This is it's going to be like this forever. I mean, I've met the right woman. I've got the right feelings. She's got the right feelings. And the reality is that's not an adequate foundation because you're going to come down off the high. And then you're going to have to deal with what Mama said. Because Mama saw some things you didn't see. And we're dealing with a real person. We're back in the real world. And everyone has flaws. And now these things surface. Our conflicts arise. We don't know how to solve them. We get into arguments. And a year down the road, we're asking, why did we get married?
This is the business of relationship. And it's the business of relationship that often totally intimidates and turns young couples off.
Yeah, and I do think it's important in the midst of all of that to keep emotional love alive. And that's why one of the things I say in the book is, I wish I'd known that romantic love has 2 stages. The euphoric stage, then you have to move into the more intentional stage. Right. Where you learn how to communicate love to the other person in a language that they will understand.
Give us a quick summary right now of the 5.
Well, basically, there's 5 fundamental ways to communicate love emotionally. One is words of affirmation. You look really nice in that outfit. Yeah. Really appreciate what you did. Then there's acts of service, doing something for your spouse. Cooking a meal, washing dishes, and mowing grass, doing something you know they would like for you to do. Then there's gifts, universal, to give gifts as an expression of love. And then quality time, giving them your undivided attention. Number 5, physical touch. We've long known the emotional power of physical touch. And the idea is that each of us has a primary love language. Very similar, Jim, to spoken language. Everyone grows up speaking a language with a dialect, okay? I grew up speaking English, Southern style, right, U.S., okay? Right. But everyone grows up with a language and a dialect, and that's the one they understand best. Same thing is true with love. And if you don't speak love in the language of the other person, you can be sincerely loving them and they don't get it. And many couples miss each other because they don't get it.
When you're coaching young couples about these 5 love languages, do you give them any hints as to how to identify their future spouse's love language?
Observe how they typically express love to our appreciation to other people. Yeah. If they're always patting people on the back, physical touch is probably their language. If they're the kind of person that likes to have lunch with their friends, quality time is probably their language. So observe their behavior. Listen to their complaints. What do they complain about? The wife who says, we don't ever spend any time together, is telling you that quality time is her love language and she's not getting it from you. Right. And then also, what do they request of you most often? If they're saying to you, could you give me a back rub? They're asking for physical touch. Or could we take a walk together? They're asking for quality time. So if you put those 3 things together, observe their behavior, what are their complaints, and what do they request most often, you can figure out a person's love language.
Have you ever suggested to couples that they do a personality test, you know, and discover what the other person is like from just a psychological profile?
Yeah. I think that's always very healthy to do that. Many couples don't do that. But whatever profile you use, and there's many of them, you need to know something of how the patterned way in which this person responds to life. You know, we talk, for example, about optimistic people and pessimistic people. Those are very different orientations to life, and it's a personality trait. And the question is, if this person's basic personality trait is always to see the negative and always to come across pessimistic, is that okay with you to live with that for the rest of your life? Because typically, they're not going to change radically. They can have what I call significant growth, but it's not going to be radical growth. They're going to tend to always see the negative side. And that's just one little trait, of course. You know, one of the things in my marriage, there are morning people and night people. I didn't know that. And I dreamed that my wife and I, once we got married, would have breakfast together and have devotions together. We're going to start the day together. And after I got married, I found out my wife was not a morning person. she doesn't do mornings, and that dream had to go. Fine, we can live with different personality patterns, but if we know what they are before we get married, we're less likely to be disappointed and frustrated once we get into the marriage.
I'm going to change him.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
Well, we don't change people. We influence people, but we don't change people. We influence people every single day. If the husband walks into the room, he's been at work, he walks in, he gives his wife a kiss and gives her a hug and asks her how her day has been, he's influencing her in a positive way. If he walks into the house, doesn't even go find her, gets him something to drink, flips on the TV, sits down and watches TV, he's influencing her, but in a negative way. So we do influence each other, but we don't change each other. And basic patterns don't change unless a person has a radical encounter with God. They may have something in their life, and God can change people, but we don't change people.
You're very transparent about your own marriage, which I think really lends a lot of credibility to the book. What do you think was the toughest challenge that you faced in the first, say, 10, 15 years of your marriage? The toughest one?
Well, it's hard to say what was toughest because we had a hard time in many areas.
Yeah.
But I think one area was I did not know how to process differences. When you're in love, you don't think you're going to have any differences. Yeah. And all these things started coming out when I came down off the high. And I found out I didn't know how to process them. So what I did is what I thought, most people do, I think. I tried to explain it to her because I had the idea any sane person would understand what I'm saying. Now, I want to tell you this one more time. And I tried to convince her in whatever the conflict that my idea was the right idea. I had no concept of knowing how to listen to a person, try to understand how they're processing it in their mind, and be able to say, I hear what you're saying, and it makes sense. I still may not agree with it, but I can honestly say if I listen long enough, it makes sense. Now, we see it differently. How can we process it? How can we solve the problem? I didn't have that concept. To me, it was an argument. You won the argument because you were on the right and they were wrong. And consequently, that alone caused us an awful lot of heated, tension in our marriage.
Is this Venus-Mars polarity? Women are from Venus, men are from Mars. We think differently, we see the world differently.
Well, that's part of it. Yeah. But part of it is just being human.
Yeah.
Any two humans are going to think differently, they're going to feel differently, they're going to process thought differently. And so we have to learn how to respect them as a human made in God's image and affirm what they say, even if you don't agree with it. Try to understand it, how they could think that way, and focus on finding a solution rather than winning an argument.
When you say forgiveness is not a feeling, expand on that.
Yeah. Well, I wish I had known that because I had the idea as an adult and in my marriage that forgiveness was a feeling, that they apologized, you sincerely heard the apology, and consequently you felt good about forgiving them. The reality is that forgiveness is a decision. You decide to forgive the person. You may still feel hurt. You may still feel angry, but you are choosing to forgive them. They've committed something, they've hurt you deeply, they've apologized to you, and you choose to forgive them. The model, of course, is our relationship with God. God forgives us. If we confess our sins, He's faithful and just to forgive us. So when someone apologizes, we choose to forgive them. We let it go. And when the memory comes back, and this is where many people struggle, when the memory comes back, the pain comes back, and you take it to God, and you say, Lord, you know what I'm remembering, and you know what I'm feeling again, but I thank you, that's forgiven. Now help me to do something good today that will enhance this relationship. And you don't let the failures of yesterday mess up today.
With all the counseling you've done, I'm sure you've encountered this more than once. A couple sit there across your desk and they say, one of them says, now he or she has been unfaithful to me. Yeah. And I have forgiven him, but frankly, I just don't trust him.
Yeah.
Is that a natural reaction, and how do you deal with that?
It is a natural reaction, and I say, you're normal.
Yeah.
Because trust is not reborn by forgiveness. Sometimes people think forgiveness and trust are the same thing. No. Forgiveness opens the door to the possibility of rebuilding trust. How do we lose trust? A person is untrustworthy. They broke the covenant in this case. How do you regain trust? By the person being trustworthy. So I say to a person who's been unfaithful to their spouse, and they've now confessed and turned back and are rebuilding the relationship, if you want to rebuild the trust of your spouse, what you say to them is, my cell phone is yours anytime you want to look at it. My computer is yours to look at it anytime you wish. If I tell you I'm going to see someone, you can call over there and see if I'm there. I'm through with deceit. My life is an open book. And you take that attitude and you follow through with that, they will come to trust you again. But it takes time to rebuild trust.
There's also a sense with forgiveness that if I forgive, I am endorsing bad behavior, I'm empowering dysfunction, or I'm turning a blind eye to an injustice.
Yeah.
And there's a great need we all have for justice.
Yeah.
What do you counsel couples on that score?
Well, the reality is, Jim, that we are creatures made in the image of God, and God is a just God, and consequently, we do have a concern for right and for justice. But God is also merciful, and because Christ paid our penalty, He can forgive us and still be just. And because He paid the penalty for my sins and my spouse's sins, I can also forgive them and still not deny justice. I'm showing mercy rather than justice.
Yeah, mercy trumps justice, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
It really does. Something I think that when couples read your book, they're going to say, whoa, spirituality is not to be acquainted with going to church.
Yeah.
Again and again, as a pastor, I've seen this. He's a Christian guy. I mean, when we were dating, he went to church with me, and he still comes to church with me. But man, at home,
yeah.
He's something else. He's beating me, or he's abusing the kids, but he's a Christian. He's going to church.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you say?
Often, Jim, when I'm counseling couples before they get married, I always raise this question about the spiritual issues. Yeah. And often the common answer is, oh yes, he's a Christian, he goes to St. Joseph, or he goes to somewhere,
Yeah.
and that's supposed to be it. They go to church, or they're a member of a church. But we know there's all kind of Christians. I mean, there's Sunday morning Christians, there's Christmas and Easter Christians,
Yeah.
there's daily devotional Christians, And what I'm saying is you have to explore the foundation of spirituality much deeper than we're both Christians and therefore everything is fine. You have to dig into what are their basic beliefs about Christ, about God, about prayer, about the Scriptures, and how do they practice these things. And this is not hard to discover. If you keep your eyes open, you can tell before you get married.
And you do have to keep your eyes open, because what you hear may not be necessarily the truth. I mean, people are putting on their best behavior when they're trying to win someone into a marriage, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Trying to say what they think the other person wants to hear, and really, intentionally trying to win the other person. The old English word is to woo.
Yeah.
But to watch them and to observe is another matter.
And also to talk with their friends.
Yeah.
Because sometimes they're with their friends when they're not with you. And their friends have a different opinion of them than you have. You may talk to a guy's friend, for example, and he may say, Bob or Joe or whatever his name is, he begins to tell you something about him that you find it hard to believe. But listen, this guy's seen it. Listen to what he's saying. You see, when we're in love, we tend to push off what things people say to us about our potential spouse. I think we have to be serious, we have to listen to them, and then we bring it up with the person. We discuss it with the person.
This is like relational due diligence.
It is. And I think before we get married, Jim, we need to explore the spiritual foundation, because the spiritual foundation affects everything else in the marriage.
My dad gave me some really good advice back when I was a kid. He started talking to me about relationships as soon as I understood that there were relationships. He talked to me about sex before I was 5 years of age, so it was never an issue in terms of my understanding of these things. But he said to me when I was about 14 or 15, he said, now, Jim, he said, by the time you're about 17 or so, he said, you're going to be looking around, and he said, you're going to see girls that are pretty attractive. He said, if you can, stand back and just watch what they laugh at, who their friends are, how they dress, if you can get any indication of what their values might be. But he said, the real kicker, he said, is try to meet their mom. And he said, then imagine her mom married to me, your dad. And he said, you'll have a pretty good idea what you're looking at. Was that good advice?
That was great advice.
Yeah.
The way I put it in the book is, I wish I'd known that the old saying, like mother, like daughter, like father, like son, is not a myth. Look at his father if you want to know what he will be like in 10 years.
The apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
It does not.